Hey guys, welcome to Grad Coach TV, where we demystify and simplify the oftentimes confusing world of academic research. My name's David, and today I'm chatting to Kerryn, one of our trusted dissertation coaches, about a great framework to use when you're thinking about your research design. In this case, it's Saunders' Research Onion. This discussion is based on one of the many articles over at the Grad Coach blog. So, if you'd like to find out more about the Research Onion, head over to gradcoach.com/blog. Also, if you're looking for a helping hand with your dissertation, thesis, or research project, be sure to check out our one-on-one private coaching service, where one of our coaches will guide you through your research journey step by step. For more information and to book a free consultation with one of our coaches, check out gradcoach.com. Hey Kerryn, welcome back to the Coachcast. As always, it's great to have you on with us.
Thanks, David. It's great to be back.
So today, Kerryn, we're talking about the Research Onion. What is it? Why is it important? And is it something we actually need to be thinking about?
Yes, so the Research Onion is one tool that allows you as a researcher to make a series of choices when it comes to your methodology or your research design. So if we think about research more broadly, it's quite typical, you will know, David, for somebody to come and see us and they'll say, look, I know what I want to do. I want to do a survey, or I know what I want to do. I want to do an interview or something like that, because they're sort of jumping quite directly into that data collection, data analysis space. And what tends to happen, especially when you're writing up your methodology, is you realize that in order to sort of justify those choices, there are a whole bunch of research design steps that actually need to be unpacked first. And if you haven't kind of made those choices, then it's a little bit more difficult to justify why you're choosing the data collection situation or design that you're choosing. And it also comes across as perhaps a little inconsistent on occasion. So going through a tool like the Research Onion is a very helpful and powerful way of just making sure that those choices that you're making are consistent and well justified. And once again, it's one of many, but it is quite useful, especially if you're doing if you're coming from a place of like business or social sciences, where your choices are probably far broader than they would be perhaps in the sciences or engineering perhaps.
I can totally agree with that. I came from the zoological sciences and Research Onions were not mentioned. It was assumed we were doing experimental research and nothing else. But I think it's still a really great tool. And the primary way that it's really helpful is it ensures alignment in your project. As you mentioned, Kerryn, there's these design decisions that we make when designing our research project, and they all sort of feed into each other. And so if we come at it from the start to the end, we're going to have a much clearer justification for our design methodology. So as I said, today we're talking about the Research Onion, and it's quite a layered onion. So we're going to start right at the broadest layer. And this is probably the first layer that's going to be the most confusing and can be a little bit daunting. But that first layer is the research philosophy. So Kerryn, what is it, and is it as bad as it comes across?
It definitely can seem like, like an onion, that outer layer, you just don't want to eat it. But, but to get to the middle, you kind of need to at least cut through it. So research philosophy feels like quite a vague term. But really, at the end of the day, what you're really trying to get across is, this is how I, as a researcher, am seeing reality, seeing truth. And that's kind of called ontology, but you don't have to worry about those terms. Then you're also saying, and this is how I think, as a researcher, I can gain knowledge or understand a little bit more of this truth. And this is sort of epistemology. And then you're also saying, and as a researcher, this is how I feel I should contribute to this research, or where I feel I belong in the context of this research. And that's sort of axiology. Don't quote me on these definitions, but at a high level, that's kind of what you're looking at. And luckily, these are sort of packaged in little in groups, if you will, of philosophy choices that you can make as a researcher. And the reason that it's important philosophically is actually because as a research design choice, it also sort of feeds into why you're choosing this kind of research that
Mm.
you're choosing, and why you as a researcher might feel more comfortable with some choices than with others. And I don't
Mm.
know about you, David, but if somebody comes to me and they say, look here, I don't know what kind of method I need to choose, one of the first questions I ask them is, what kind of person are you? Are
Yeah.
you a person who likes numbers and facts and needs to get
Mm-hmm.
and understands them intuitively, or are you somebody who likes nuance and exploration? And those might actually help guide your research choices at the end of the day. And really, that
Exactly.
is your philosophy as a researcher. So, in terms of those philosophy packages that you can choose from,
Yes.
you can choose technically on the one side of the spectrum, and I'm really only going to mention two because these are sort of two that are common. On the
Mm.
one side of the spectrum, you've got sort of positivism. And this is more associated with sort of the scientific method. You believe in a single truth or a single
Mm.
reality. And you feel as a researcher, you need to try and distance yourself. You need to be more objective. You need to
Mm.
be more unbiased. And you also feel, generally speaking, that a huge chunk of how you can understand the world can be told to you
Mm.
through numbers. And if it can't really be told to you through numbers, if you can't really figure it out that way, then it's probably not something you're going to be researching as a researcher, as a positivist researcher. So in this context, a good positivist research will have a theory or a hypothesis that
Mm.
you can go and test with numbers. That's at least the idea behind positivism. In terms of the other side of the spectrum, and
Mm.
really there's a lot to choose from, but most commonly on the other side of the spectrum, we've got interpretivism. And
Mm.
interpretivism is, I wouldn't say always the opposite, but you are, as a researcher, perhaps less interested in numbers, the average, the
Mm.
total. You're more interested in the nuance, in the potential multiple realities that may
Yes.
exist. You're interested in opinions, in experiences, and in that context, you as a researcher are more likely to build theories rather
Mm.
than test them or test hypotheses. You as a researcher won't try to be unbiased. You would be a bit more reflexive. You'd be trying to figure out where you fit and how that might influence your interpretations of
Mm.
what you're gaining and the information that you're learning. So in this context, you acknowledge your subjectivity as a researcher, and you
Mm.
kind of just move on with it, if you will. For the vast majority of people, I think we don't really feel like we should choose.
Mm.
Some people are a little bit more comfortable with maybe even using both techniques because they feel like they can gain a little bit more out of their research.
Mm.
But then in that context, if you feel a little bit more comfortable with both sides of the spectrum, you may be a pragmatist.
I think that's a great explanation that you've done there, Kerryn, and really helps us understand what these philosophies are. But it does come up to the question of how do we choose which philosophy belongs to us? And I think it was great advice that you gave, that really think about how you think about the world and let that lead your research philosophy. But broadly, as a bit of advice, keep in mind what your research aims and objectives and questions are, because that's going to lead you into making that choice of what philosophy fits best. For example, if your research question is, what is the bioenergy potential of cattle dung within rural England? That we're really looking for a numeric answer. What is the capacity of bioenergy? And so really that leans more towards a positivist approach. There is an answer that we can collect one truth on based on numbers. On the same topic, but a different research question would be, what are the opinions of farmers on the potential of using cattle dung for bioenergy? That's then much more focused on the nuance and interpretation, and we expect there to be varied responses. And so that's again leading us more towards an interpretivist philosophy. So that's just an example of how your aims and objectives can sort of lead your philosophy choice. But again, what I would suggest is do take a wide read on what the philosophies overall assume and then use that to guide you as well. So now that we've chosen our research philosophy, the second layer in the onion is our research approach. And this will often follow on through from your first layer, but Kerryn, what is the research approach and how do we make these decisions about it?
Generally speaking, there are a couple of main decisions that can be made under research approach. The first is inductive versus deductive, and it's a little bit more complicated than that, but those are the two main ones that are taken in the first sort of group of approaches. And then the second group of approaches, I would say, would be qualitative versus quantitative. And let me go sort of back to the first group of approaches, and that's inductive versus deductive. What these two opposing, if you will, approaches essentially mean is, to what extent is the data related to the theory? And data means that the stuff that you're going to be collecting, the stuff that you're going to be analyzing, and the theory meaning the way that you're going to be packaging that together. Now, for inductive, generally speaking, perhaps when you were doing your literature review, you would realize that there's just not a lot out there regarding this research question and the theories behind it. And in that case, you might decide to take an inductive approach where your data will be actually creating the theory for you. You're going to be using that data and sort of allowing it, if you will, to sort of be packaged into groups depending on what you've noticed and what's common and what's not common, and how you're going to compare the little elements that are coming from your research. And in that way, the data is creating the theory for you, and you're going to be using that in the context of your results and perhaps your discussion chapter to present new theory. For deductive, it's the other way around. Perhaps what you've noticed is that a lot of people have studied this sort of broad topic before, and they've got a few ideas as to how you can sort of package that data together into a theory. So what you might do in your literature review is you might say, well, since this is what I've been reading about, this is how I think all of the data will be looking. This is how I think we can start comparing it and packaging it. And then that way, you're having a little bit more of a deductive approach. You're going to be using the theory to sort of package and parcel the data for you into little segments, and you're going to be using that data to then test the theory rather than to create the theory. And that's sort of just a broad way of sort of thinking about deductive versus inductive. And of course, there are definitely ways in which you can, do something a little bit more complex in terms of, how you're going to look at the data. But those are the two main ones that you should consider in the context of your data approach and your research approach. The second package of approaches, if you will, is qualitative versus quantitative. And I think we have a little bit more of an intuitive understanding about what that means. But qualitative is essentially using words, using images, using descriptions, using maybe even videos in this context, and creating meaning out of what you're seeing and what you're hearing. So this is very common in terms of like maybe interviews where you're trying to sort of, where you're going to be getting words back, not just numbers back to you. Or if you're looking at images and you try and make sense of what you're seeing in an image, then that is a little bit more common under more qualitative approaches. And then for quantitative approaches, it's going to be using numbers. So whatever you have, you're going to be much more interested in turning it into some kind of numeric value, be it category 1 versus category 2. I'm going to package it into one of these two categories, in which case everything, gets packaged into a quantitative value. Or maybe it's as simple as a measurement, like you are 1.6 meters tall. I'm 1.6 meters tall, and therefore that's a measurement. It's got a numeric value, and therefore it's quantitative. And how you use it will then be through some kind of quantitative approach, because you can be looking at those numbers together by either counting the different things that you're putting into your different categories, or maybe creating an average of the different quantitative results that you're going to be getting from your analysis. So those are the two, I would say, main ways in which you can consider a research approach.
I think that was really helpful, Kerryn. And as you said there, it's not an easy decision to make. And again, there is some nuance here. But broadly speaking, there's those two sections. And when we're thinking about how to make those decisions, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it really does depend on your research aims and your research questions. So we want to be thinking about some examples. For instance, if we have the research question, how do programmers experience working from home in Colorado? That's research that is new research that doesn't really have much background to it. And so that's going to lean more towards an inductive approach. And similarly, we're asking about their experience, which is sort of word-based. And so that's going to lean towards qualitative research. And so you can see how your research aim or question will lean you towards that specific design approach. Another example, just flipping the same topic but asking a different research question, is to what extent does working from home relate to employee satisfaction among programmers in Colorado? Here we've got numeric data, we've got employee satisfaction, we've got a factor that we're looking at in terms of remote working, and there's potentially already research that has been done on this in other states or countries. And so we can then apply those theories or those hypotheses from previous data to test that here. So this might be a deductive quantitative approach. Again, there's nuance here, and it's important to understand these terms, but this is just broad strokes, sort of how we decide on our research approach. So once you've settled on a research approach, the next layer is your research strategy. And this is often enough going to really follow on from that decision. Again, I keep saying the same things, but that's the benefit of the onion. It is a flow. As you move from one layer to the next, they are going to give you more support. So Kerryn, what is the research strategy and what are the options that we can choose here?
Yes, so I think as soon as we start getting into research strategy territory, we start, building research that looks probably more similar to the kind of research that we're reading, right? So it's a little bit less broad of a group or of a layer, because now you're starting to sort of hone in your research in the direction that you're wanting, and you can start imagining your research in a little bit more of a sort of a tangible way, I think.
Yes.
And I think that makes it quite valuable, but it also means that you've got a lot more choices.
Yeah.
And I think broadly, I think these are the more common choices that we see that I'm going to be mentioning here. The first is that of experimental research. That would be research territory where you have an experiment, where you have perhaps you're trying to sort of trial a drug and see what the impact of that drug is, or perhaps maybe the symptoms, or that were unintended. And what you would have in that context is you might have two groups. You'll have one group who gets the drug, and you'll have another group that might get a placebo, for instance. And you're going to be comparing that in an experimental way. Of course, experimental research will usually not just be in medicine, but you might even do experimental research when it comes to something like dog food, where you've got a brand of dog food that you feel is very nutritious, and you're going to create an experiment where you're going to have some dogs be fed this nutritious food and or potentially more nutritious food, and other dogs that will be maybe given some more of a general house brand, and you'll sort of compare maybe the healthfulness of these dogs in a given time, right? And so experimental research is usually a little bit more comparative, where you do have a group that you as a researcher are in control of, and a group that you in the research as a researcher will have some control in terms of giving them the experiment that you're planning on designing, the intervention or the drug or the vaccine or what have you. Generally speaking, or almost always, experimental research will be in the quantitative, layer two, in terms of your approach, because there will be sort of a numeric way of, comparing your control and your experimental groups. So that's, I think, one big one for the scientists mostly, but you still see it in education research. You see it, across the board, wherever there's some kind of intervention. Another strategy that we see quite commonly, and most people will be doing this kind of research, is that of a descriptive or correlational research. That sort of is in the territory where you as a researcher might be sending out a survey, right? Maybe you're doing some market research for your firm, or some survey research for your MBA, in which case you're sort of sending out a survey to a specific population in hopes, or hopefully not just in hopes, with some kind of good understanding that that sample that you're sending that survey to is going to be representing a larger population on some level. And the results that you're going to get back in terms of maybe the demographics, in terms of their interest in the product that you're trying to sell them, that kind of thing will be reflective of the population that you're interested in targeting as a whole. So that's also a very common form of research that you will see. Generally speaking, we also get something like action research. Action research is where your research has some kind of intervention where you think that, or you have good reason to believe that your research will actually benefit the people in your sample, or the thing that you're targeting, the sample that you're targeting. And in that context, action research is quite beneficial to the people that you're targeting, and that has implications, especially if you're wanting to, get ethical approval. It has implication, on your soul as a researcher. So your action research is sort of benefiting somebody else that you're targeting, and you're not just being sort of an extractive researcher and just sort of taking from your sample. You are in some ways giving back, either through education research, where you as a researcher are providing a school with some resources in the context of your research, and you're getting some information back around the impact or the effectiveness of that intervention. And in this context, this research could be quantitative or qualitative. It really depends on the nature of your research. But action research can, maybe touch on other kinds of research strategies as well. But that's the sort of broad focus or aim, if you will, of an action research. You also get, or we get quite commonly, grounded theory. That is research that happens literally building a theory from the ground up, where you as a researcher might have very little understanding as to what the impact or what the data might tell you. And as a result, you are trying to sort of see if you can build a theory based on what you observe or the interviews that you conduct or something like that, if you will. And quite often grounded theory is done in a couple of layers, where the first layer, maybe you're doing something like a series of interviews and you notice a pattern in these interviews and you design a theory from those patterns. And then in the second layer, you might sort of see if those patterns still hold on another group, for instance, that you interview. And that's another common research strategy that we see.
Thanks, Kerryn, for covering some of those primary options that we see. But it's worth noting there are a range of other options out there. For example, there is case study research, archival research. There are just way too many options out there. So what I would suggest here is do your own research. See what's being done in your field in relation to questions that are similar to your research questions. Use those as a guide. Remember, we stand on the shoulders of giants, so it's useful to go back and see what other people have done as a research strategy to answer similar research questions. So go back to that research aim, research question, research hypotheses or objectives, and really take a look at what would best help you to answer that. So now that we've decided on a research strategy at layer 3, we'll generally move on to layer 4, which is the research choices that need to be made. Kerryn, maybe you can give us a little bit more detail about what this entails.
Yeah, so research choices can incorporate quite a few things. You might realize now that you've finished with layer 3 that you need to do a little bit of reflecting as to what this research might actually look like at like a little bit more of a bare bones level, right? Like now you have to start imagining the research, if you will.
Yes.
And you might realize that actually, when it comes to the data and the data analysis, it's not just a simple singular approach, or maybe it is a simple singular approach, but now this is the layer where you want to be purposeful about that. And so in this context, think about this very straightforward and at some level as how many choices or how many data analysis methods am I actually going to be using? And you might have realized already quite early on, maybe when you're choosing one of your approaches, that maybe qualitative or quantitative didn't quite fit your bill. Maybe you needed to do something a little bit more hybrid in terms of your approach. And so now's the time to sort of reflect on what that actually looks like and be purposeful with it. Now, my big thing, and I love mixed methods, so I'm the mixed methods coach, but my big thing really is that you really want to be purposeful with how many methods you use. Don't be in a situation where you are saying, okay, well, I want to analyze, this case study, and therefore I'm going to interview people and survey people and, collect documents and look at, the performance of the company over time, because you're just going to be scattering yourself all over the place.
Yes.
So now you really need to start being very purposeful with what it is that you're actually going to be doing at a practical level. So in the context of what is available to you, you might realize that even if you're wanting to stick with qualitative methods, you actually still have quite a few options. Maybe you know what kind of method you're going to be using. You can do a narrative analysis, you can do a thematic analysis, you can make a whole bunch of different choices. And even within the realm of quantitative research, you realize, oh, well, actually, I'm going to be largely describing, but there are some actual specific inferential tests or predictions that I'm wanting to make. So you're starting to realize that actually, you're not just doing one thing. You might realize that you're actually wanting to do several things. At a higher level, even if you're wanting to do several things in your research, you might realize that actually incorporates both qualitative and quantitative elements. Or maybe you're wanting to do two different kinds of research strategies, in which case you want to be very purposeful and limited in your choices. So typically, and in the vast majority of research for, like, let's say, shorter master's dissertations, where it's not just your full master's, but maybe a component of your master's, where you have other coursework or maybe honors projects, you're wanting to ideally stick to a mono method, where you have one thing like a quantitative experimental research or a qualitative series of interviews. That would be a mono method, where you've got one method that is going to really be the shining star of your research and will inform on all your results and your discussion later on in your chapters. But you definitely get a lot of people who say, actually, I'm wanting to use both qualitative and quantitative. And my big advice with that is, if you're going to do that mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative, approach to your research, be purposeful. What is the value of the qualitative and what is the value of the quantitative, and how do they marry? What is their connection? You need to ask yourself, are they going to be happening in sequence? Do I need one first before I go into the other? Will I be using the one to maybe triangulate or test the other in some way? And when you start realizing, hey, actually, I need to be purposeful with this, you start preventing yourself from scattering. Another common strategy, although maybe another less common strategy really, is a multi-method, where perhaps you're using something like a document analysis and an interview. Once again, not always recommended. Be purposeful with it. Perhaps they're both slightly qualitative. Maybe you're realizing you're wanting some numbers in the documents that you're wanting to use as some support. And that's fine, absolutely fine. But be purposeful. Make sure that it's aligning with your research questions, and make sure that you're not just scattering yourself and trying to grab what you can get out of the world's limitless data that is out there. So basically, when it comes to research choices, this is a layer where you want to sort of limit yourself a bit and be purposeful with your selections and choices.
That's great advice, Kerryn, and definitely something I can put all my weights behind as well. Make choices that really answer your research aims and objectives. We don't want to be spreading ourselves too thin, and this is really the layer where we get to focus on that. How we can make sure that the analysis we're choosing is going to give us the data we need to answer our research question. We always talk about that alignment. This is kind of where it really comes into its own. So the fifth layer, time horizon, is going to probably come up a bit while you're thinking about the research choices. But Kerryn, what is time horizon, and why is it important to keep in account during the research design?
Yes, so time horizon is one of those things that, let's just say, won't impact a lot of people, generally speaking, who might come to Grad Coach or who might be watching this video, because time is a very difficult thing to study. Let's just put it that way. And in that context, the vast majority of people will have what's called cross-sectional research, where you kind of, the research that you're collecting is more or less collected, or the data that you're collecting is more or less collected at one point in time, right? Maybe per individual, there are some people you collected, at the beginning of the month, and some people that you collected the following month. But generally speaking, it's interested in one sort of slice in time, and you're trying to sort of unpack or showcase some kind of description about how people feel about an issue, for instance, in that space or at that time period. Time in that context is not really too much of a factor, right? It's not going to be something that you're going to be incorporating in your measurements, if you will. The other side of the coin is longitudinal research, where you're interested in collecting data points for each maybe person in your sample or ecological, cordoned off area, whatever your sample is, at different points in time for an understanding of how things have changed over time. So you see longitudinal research far more commonly where there are big teams of researchers, because it can be a little bit more expensive. It does take quite a long time. So you're usually within a team. Very rarely do you get individual researchers doing one, longitudinal project. Certainly not for graduate school, because that will take quite a long time to collect the data and is usually a little bit more impractical. But if you're part of a team of researchers and they've been collecting data over time, then you tend to be a lot more likely to have to be involved in longitudinal research. So where you see longitudinal research is more common in maybe developmental research, where perhaps people are interested in whether you're reading to your children and whether that impacts their high school scores later on, like a few years later. Maybe you're interested in ecological research. Maybe the government's cordoned off an area and they're wanting to sort of see and assess whether that area ecologically is starting to recover from perhaps, things that had happened in the past, maybe a big fire, or maybe, human damage, or, animal damage, or what have you. So that in that context, time is a very important factor, because you're trying to see how things have changed from when you initially collected the data to that point in time from the same sample. So that is a little bit more common in bigger team research, although you might see some kinds of longitudinal research that is being conducted in interventions. So for instance, maybe psychological counseling and its impact on perhaps women who've been abused. You're wanting to sort of see whether that is impacting them positively over, a period of time, maybe during the intervention and maybe even after the intervention. So you'll be conducting a few measurements on the same people over that time period.
That's great, Kerryn. And I think you've really clearly explained what time horizon is. I think one thing to keep in mind, though, is a lot of people will feel that longitudinal data is richer, or you're collecting more information, so it's the better option. But I'd just like to say it's really not the case. They're asking different questions. So don't let the desire to collect more data push you into a longitudinal data. Always take a look at how it fits with your research question. Now, your sixth and final layer, and it's technically not one layer, there's a whole bunch of layers within this, is your techniques and procedures. Kerryn, what is this last bit of, the core of the onion, so to speak?
Yes. So, if you're reading a recipe blog and all of that description that happened at the beginning of the blog was the rest of the onion, this is actually sort of more the method side of the actual recipe. And so I think over here, we're talking about the actual practical nitty-gritty, what I did or what I intended to do. And in general, this is not a single thing to think about. It's a single layer, because quite often it's the practical stuff. But in the context of the various sections in your methodology chapter, there will be several sections that will be covering these practical elements. Things like the data collection section. That is, what was the specific things that you were doing in order to collect your data? So here is finally where you're going to say, I collected survey data, or I conducted interviews, or I, had a focus group, or some combination of these. And so this is that data collection section is what you actually did. And it's very easy to say I made this choice, but in a methodology, you do want to be quite descriptive in how you made those choices. How did you send those surveys? What databases were you using to collect maybe people's email addresses or something like that? So you have to sort of really think about the practical elements, the nitty-gritty of what exactly did you do to send out that survey and collect that data. Similarly, you will have a section on sampling, and sampling is a very important section because it's really not just I collected surveys, but exactly from who and how did you make those choices as to who was being a part of those that data collection. And so sampling will also have quite a chunky practical series of things that you will need to say. I collected it from these kinds of people who work in this environment and and are between this age and this age. So you already put in the inclusion and exclusion criteria of who belonged in your sample and why they were selected. And then another sort of very important area is the analysis. So now that we know how you collected your data and who you collected that data from or what you collected that data from, now it's time to say, well, how did you actually analyze that data? What did you do with that data? And sometimes this is where the earlier parts of the onion do help, right? So in the context of an interview, when you're collecting your data, maybe you collected 12 interviews from, working nurses in a particular hospital, but how did you analyze that data? What did you do with that data? And here is where you can say, okay, well, I know that earlier on I said I'm going to use an inductive approach. So therefore, I'm going to maybe do a inductive thematic analysis. And that is a choice that you're making for your analysis space. And similarly with maybe experimental data, where if you decided to do an experimental quantitative research, you might say, okay, well, I'm going to be using SPSS, which is a statistical program, to do a bunch of inferential tests such as X, and then you can make your choices and what you did. So your data analysis is once again the practical elements, what you're using, what you did, and how you're analyzing that data. So if you think about this layer as also having these three components of data collection, sampling, and data analysis, then it can sort of help you sort of flesh out your methodology chapter a bit.
So thanks so much for that, Kerryn. It's been really helpful talking through the final layer or core of the onion in terms of techniques and procedures. It's worth noting it's important that there is clear alignment across this entire layer and to the other layers as well. We want to make sure that all the decisions are building towards answering your research question and your aims. I sound like a broken record, but it's important to note, and that there is clear alignment across the board. We don't want it to come across that at the earlier layers we spoke about doing a qualitative research project and inductive reasoning, and now we're talking about quantitative statistics. Then there is misalignment, and that can be problematic. Similarly as well, if earlier we spoke about using a deductive approach, you don't want to suddenly be talking about grounded theory. And really we're aiming to make sure that there is clear alignment in this section. It's also worth noting that this is probably going to be the lion's share of your methodology chapter. It is the majority of what you did and why you did it. And so it's really important to cover this in quite a lot of detail. Kerryn, it's been absolutely great having you. Thanks so much for running us through the research onion as one of the frameworks for writing up and understanding your research methodology and design decisions.
Thank you, David. It was great to be here.
All right, so that pretty much wraps up this episode of Grad Coach TV. Remember, for more information about the Research Onion, be sure to check out our blog at gradcoach.com/blog. There you can also get access to our free dissertation and thesis writing mini course, which will give you all the basic information you need to get started with your project. Also, if you're looking for a helping hand with your dissertation, thesis, or research project, be sure to check out our one-on-one private coaching service, where you can work with one of our friendly coaches, just like Kerryn, and they'll help you throughout your entire research journey. For more information and to book a free consultation, head over to www.gradcoach.com. Well, that's it for today. Until next time, good luck.